The world only remembers the names written in lights, but it almost never remembers the people who kept the lights from going out. I used to believe that was simply how life worked. Some people walked through the front entrance wearing tailored suits that cost more than my yearly rent, while people like me slipped in through the loading dock carrying coffee trays, extension cords, and emergency sewing kits. At 26 years old, I had become invisible by profession. My name was Claire Bennett, and if everything went perfectly, nobody attending the Horizon Arts Awards would ever know I existed. That was considered success. The backstage corridors of the Manhattan Grand Theater smelled like fresh paint, expensive perfume drifting in from the lobby, and the faint metallic scent of lighting equipment that had been running since sunrise. My sneakers barely made a sound against the concrete floor as I hurried past stagehands rolling massive camera rigs worth more than my parents' old house in Ohio. My headset crackled with overlapping voices. Somebody needed another microphone. Somebody couldn't find the keynote speaker. Somebody had spilled sparkling water near the orchestra pit. Organized chaos. The kind I secretly loved. While celebrities practiced acceptance speeches under crystal chandeliers, I was kneeling beside a loose cable with black tape between my teeth, making sure nobody tripped once the cameras started rolling. Nobody applauded that kind of work. Nobody posted about it online. But if I did my job right, millions of people watching from home would believe the evening unfolded effortlessly. I checked my watch. 6:43. 17 minutes until the live broadcast. My phone buzzed inside my pocket. My younger brother, Ethan. Good luck tonight, sis. One day your name will be on one of those signs. I smiled despite myself. Ethan always believed impossible things with complete confidence. I typed back before sliding the phone away. I'll settle for surviving tonight without setting off the fire alarm. The laughter stayed with me for exactly 10 seconds before another voice echoed across the hallway. Claire. Wardrobe emergency. I jogged toward dressing room 4 carrying a sewing kit that had become my unofficial superpower over the past 5 years. A famous actress had torn the inside seam of her designer gown while stepping onto the rehearsal stage. She looked panicked. Everyone around her looked even worse. I quietly knelt, repaired the fabric in less than 3 minutes, and stood before anyone had finished thanking me. That's how backstage people disappeared. Solve the problem. Keep moving. Never become part of the show. As I stepped back into the hallway, I paused beside an enormous LED display that stretched nearly 30 feet across the entrance tunnel leading toward the stage. Hundreds of names flashed across the screen. Presenters. Sponsors. Winners from previous years. Legends whose careers had inspired millions. The blue light reflected softly across the polished floor, turning ordinary concrete into something almost magical. I stared for one heartbeat longer than I should have. Not because I dreamed about fame. I simply wondered what it might feel like to hear someone speak your name because you mattered instead of because something had gone wrong. Then the lights dimmed for the final rehearsal. Every conversation faded into silence. Somewhere beyond the curtains, the front doors opened. The most powerful guests in New York had begun to arrive. And without realizing it, I was only minutes away from meeting the one man who would remember my name long before the rest of the world ever learned it. The theater transformed the moment the first limousine stopped beneath the entrance canopy. I could not see the front steps from backstage, but I did not need to. The change traveled through the building like electricity. Security voices became quieter instead of louder. Production assistants stopped joking. Even the orchestra lowered their conversations to whispers between warm-up notes. Someone important had arrived. My headset crackled again. Claire, we need 2 extra champagne trays near the east corridor. VIP movement in 30 seconds. On it, I answered, balancing polished silver trays against my shoulder as I hurried through the maze of curtains and equipment cases. The hallway connecting the private entrance to the ballroom glowed beneath soft amber lights that made every marble surface look warmer than it really was. Staff members lined the walls with practiced smiles, pretending not to stare toward the security detail entering first. Four men in dark tailored suits walked with synchronized precision, speaking quietly into concealed earpieces. They did not look nervous. They looked prepared. There was a difference. Behind them came several executives from the event committee, each suddenly laughing a little too hard at jokes that had not been funny moments earlier. Whoever they were welcoming carried influence that could not be measured by applause alone. I stepped backward to give everyone room, lowering my eyes as I had been taught during my first week working high-profile events. Blend into the background. Become another piece of furniture. Then polished Italian leather shoes stopped less than 3 feet from mine. I looked up before I could remind myself not to. He was taller than I expected, maybe 6'3", wearing a charcoal suit cut so perfectly it seemed tailored for movement rather than display. Dark brown hair was brushed neatly away from a composed face that revealed almost nothing. His expression was calm, not cold. Focused. Like someone who noticed every exit without appearing to search for one. Around him, conversations subtly shifted. People straightened their posture. Smiles became more careful. Nobody rushed toward him, yet everyone seemed aware of exactly where he stood. I had never seen authority move so quietly. One of the committee members smiled brightly. "Mr. Moretti, thank you for supporting the foundation again this year. The children will never forget your generosity." Adrian Moretti answered with a small nod. "The evening is about them. Let us keep it that way." His voice surprised me. Low. Even. Without the exaggerated confidence I usually heard from wealthy donors. He accepted compliments the way someone accepted the weather. Neither encouraging nor dismissing them. As the group continued forward, one of the photographers accidentally backed into a lighting stand while searching for a better angle. I saw the stand begin to tilt before anyone else reacted. Without thinking, I set both trays on the floor and caught the metal frame with both hands just before it reached the polished marble. The photographer spun around, his face pale. "I am so sorry. I did not even see it." "It is okay," I said, steadying the equipment before checking that none of the cables had loosened. Nobody was hurt. That was all that mattered. When I stood again, I realized Adrian Moretti had stopped walking. His attention rested on me for only a moment. Not long enough to feel uncomfortable. Long enough to make me wonder why. His eyes moved from the secured lighting stand to the trays waiting on the floor and finally back to my face. "Thank you," he said simply. 2 ordinary words. Nothing dramatic. Yet something about the way he said them made them sound uncommon. Most people thank the person holding the spotlight. Very few noticed the person keeping it from falling. Before I could answer, another coordinator rushed over, apologizing for the delay and guiding the group toward the ballroom. The hallway filled with motion once again, voices overlapping as schedules resumed their relentless pace. I picked up the trays, took one steady breath, and convinced myself I had just experienced another ordinary moment at another glamorous event. I had no way of knowing that Adrian Moretti had already asked someone a quiet question as he disappeared beyond the curtains. Who is she? I returned to work before my thoughts could wander any farther. Events like this rewarded people who stayed focused, not people who replayed brief conversations with strangers who happened to wear expensive suits. The live broadcast countdown flashed across monitors positioned throughout the backstage corridors. 8 minutes. Crew members hurried past carrying backup microphones, cue cards, and garment bags protected inside clear plastic covers. Every second had a purpose. Every mistake had consequences. Mine was making the mistake of wondering why Adrian Moretti had looked at me twice. "Claire, can you take these revised seating cards to the executive lounge?" Melissa called while balancing 3 clipboards against her chest. The originals were printed with the wrong table assignments. I accepted the stack without hesitation. The executive lounge sat behind a pair of walnut doors reserved for sponsors and keynote guests, an area where staff members only entered when absolutely necessary. I knocked softly before stepping inside. The room felt strangely calm compared to the organized chaos outside. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the glowing Manhattan skyline while jazz music drifted quietly through hidden speakers. Crystal glasses reflected warm golden light across polished oak tables. Conversations remained measured, almost rehearsed. Wealth seemed to move more slowly than everyone else. I began replacing the seating cards one by one, careful not to interrupt anyone's discussions. Most guests barely noticed me. That was normal. Invisible was comfortable. Invisible was safe. As I reached the final table, I noticed an elderly server struggling with an overloaded tray filled with coffee cups. His hands trembled ever so slightly as he adjusted his grip. Before anyone else reacted, one of the porcelain cups slid dangerously close to the edge. I crossed the room in 2 quick steps and steadied the tray before gravity finished the job. "You are all right," I said quietly with a reassuring smile. "Let me help." Relief softened the man's tired face. "Thank you. My shoulder has not been the same since surgery last winter." Together we placed the cup safely onto the serving station. Nobody applauded. Nobody even looked our way except one person seated near the windows. Adrian Moretti lowered the folder he had been reading. He watched the exchange without saying a word. Across the room another sponsor chuckled lightly. "You have people for that, Adrian. You notice everything except when someone is trying to impress you." Adrian's eyes remained on the elderly server as he answered. "I notice people who help when they think nobody important is watching." There was no pride in his voice. Only certainty. I pretended not to hear as I gathered the unused seating cards. Conversations resumed around me, discussing charitable donations, investment portfolios, and upcoming construction projects. I reached the door just as another coordinator rushed inside, visibly flustered. "We have a problem. One of the youth scholarship recipients cannot find her presentation folder. She goes on stage in 12 minutes. The young girl standing beside her looked ready to cry. She could not have been older than 14. Everyone immediately began searching the room, lifting folders and checking chairs, but panic spread faster than progress. "Wait," I said, remembering something. "I saw a blue folder near the rehearsal piano about 15 minutes ago. I thought it belonged to the music director." Without waiting for instructions, I hurried back through the hallway, weaving between camera operators and stage managers until I reached the empty rehearsal corner. The folder still rested exactly where I remembered. I grabbed it and ran back, my heartbeat matching the countdown clock displayed above the stage entrance. 5 minutes until air. The girl opened the folder with shaking hands before letting out a breath that sounded almost like laughter. "This is it. Thank you so much." Tears gathered in her eyes, but this time they came from relief instead of fear. I smiled. "Go enjoy your moment. You earned it." As she hurried toward the stage, I turned to leave, assuming the evening would continue exactly as before. Instead I found Adrian Moretti standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, as though he had quietly witnessed every choice I had made since walking into that room. For a long second neither of us spoke. Then he looked toward the stage where the young scholarship recipient disappeared behind the curtains and said almost to himself, "Some people spend their lives chasing recognition. You keep giving it away." The applause rolling through the theater sounded like distant thunder from backstage. The first award had been presented without a single technical problem, and the production crew finally allowed themselves a few relieved smiles before rushing toward the next cue. I slipped back into the familiar rhythm of carrying schedules, checking equipment, and solving whatever tiny disaster appeared next. It was easier that way. Work left little room for curiosity. Still, Adrian Moretti's quiet observation lingered in the back of my mind. Some people spend their lives chasing recognition. You keep giving it away. I had no clever response because I had never thought of helping people as generosity. It was simply what decent people did when they noticed someone struggling. 20 minutes later, another request sent me toward the private hospitality suite where sponsors gathered between segments of the live broadcast. I carried a fresh stack of event programs tucked neatly beneath my arm. As I approached the entrance, I noticed a young catering assistant standing completely frozen outside the doorway. She looked barely 20 years old, her hands gripping a serving tray so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "Are you all right?" I asked softly. Her eyes filled with panic. "I spilled coffee on one of the guest jackets. They told me it belonged to the biggest donor here. If I lose this job, I cannot pay next month's rent." Before I could answer, one of the event supervisors stormed into the hallway with quick, frustrated steps. "There you are. Do you have any idea how expensive that jacket is? You should have been paying attention instead of daydreaming." Several staff members lowered their eyes. Nobody spoke. The young woman whispered an apology that sounded too small for the hallway around us. I glanced toward the stain. It was little more than a few drops near the sleeve, hardly noticeable beneath the dark fabric. "There has to be another solution," I said calmly. The supervisor looked at me with visible irritation. "This does not involve you, Claire." I understood the warning hidden inside his tone. "Keep moving. Stay invisible." Instead, I looked at the frightened assistant. "Go bring me a clean cloth and sparkling water. Quickly." She hesitated before running toward the service station. The supervisor folded his arms. "And exactly what are you planning to do?" "Buy us time," I answered. "Nothing more." A few careful minutes later, the stain had faded enough that only someone actively searching for it would notice. The fabric remained intact. The jacket looked presentable again. The young assistant exhaled so deeply I thought she might collapse from relief. "Thank you," she whispered. I shook my head. "Just remember this feeling the next time someone else needs help. That is how kindness keeps moving." I picked up the event programs and turned toward the hospitality suite, only to discover the hallway had become strangely quiet. Adrian Moretti stood near the open doorway, speaking with two board members moments earlier, but his conversation had stopped. His attention rested on the young catering assistant, whose trembling hands had finally steadied. One of the executives beside him gave a dismissive shrug. "Staff mistakes happen every day." Adrian answered without raising his voice. "Character shows up every day too. It is simply harder to notice." His eyes met mine again, calm and thoughtful rather than intense. "Most people in this building are trying very hard to be seen. You seem to be trying very hard not to be." I managed the smallest smile. "It keeps the evening running on time." For the first time since we met, the corner of his mouth lifted into something that almost resembled amusement. "Then perhaps the evening has been succeeding because of the wrong people all along." The ceremony moved forward with the flawless precision that only existed because hundreds of invisible people refused to let it fall apart. Every cue arrived on time. Every spotlight found its mark. Every standing ovation looked effortless from the audience, even though I knew how many exhausted hands had quietly held the evening together. I finally allowed myself 60 seconds beside the catering station to drink a paper cup of lukewarm coffee before my headset buzzed again. "Claire, sponsor gifts need to be transferred to the West reception room." I picked up two carefully wrapped presentation boxes and headed toward the quieter side of the theater. The hallway there was almost empty, insulated from the music and applause echoing through the main auditorium. Halfway down the corridor, I heard voices around the corner. They were not arguing. They were negotiating. I recognized one voice immediately. Adrian Moretti remained as calm in private as he did in public. There was never any need for him to raise his voice. I slowed instinctively, not to listen, but to avoid interrupting. Another man spoke with a nervous laugh. "If you attach your name to this scholarship expansion, every newspaper in the city will put you on the front page tomorrow." Adrian answered after a brief silence. "Then they will be writing about the wrong thing. The students should be remembered, not the donor." The hallway became quiet again before footsteps approached. I stepped aside just as Adrian rounded the corner. He noticed the gift boxes in my hands and moved slightly to give me more room instead of expecting me to move for him. It was a small gesture, almost invisible. Most powerful people assumed the hallway belonged to them. He did not. Long night, he asked. I smiled politely. It has been busy. Busy usually means successful. For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence did not feel uncomfortable. It felt surprisingly natural, as though neither of us needed to fill every empty second with conversation. Finally he glanced toward the wrapped boxes. You have solved at least 4 problems tonight that nobody will ever know about. I laughed quietly. 5, actually. One microphone almost disappeared before rehearsal. His eyes brightened with genuine amusement. I stand corrected. Before either of us could continue, one of the board members hurried into the hallway carrying a folder. Adrian, the interview room is ready. Every network is waiting. The man looked toward me briefly before lowering his voice. We can finish this later if you prefer. Adrian shook his head once. They have waited long enough. He turned back toward me. Thank you again, Claire. Not for the lighting stand or the missing folder. For reminding people that kindness does not need an audience. I felt unexpectedly embarrassed by the compliment. I was only doing my job. He studied me for a second before answering softly. No. You keep doing things that are not in your job description. That is why I noticed. He walked away before I could think of a response. His security team followed at a respectful distance, matching his pace without crowding him. I watched them disappear into the interview wing until my headset interrupted my thoughts once again. Claire, where are those sponsor gifts? I blinked, realizing I had been standing still for far longer than I intended. On my way, I answered, continuing toward the reception room. As I entered, a television mounted on the wall switched to the live interview. Adrian sat beneath bright studio lights while reporters asked predictable questions about business, philanthropy, and leadership. His answers remained thoughtful but measured, revealing almost nothing about himself. Then one journalist smiled and asked, "What has surprised you most about tonight?" I expected another polished answer about fundraising goals or community partnerships. Instead, Adrian looked briefly away from the cameras before saying, "Sometimes the most remarkable person in a room is the one nobody thinks to introduce." Across the reception room, nobody reacted to the comment. They assumed he was speaking in general terms. I was the only person who felt my heartbeat skip, because somehow, without saying my name, I knew exactly who he meant. The final hour of the ceremony always felt different. The excitement softened into quiet conversations, handshakes, and photographs while the production crew shifted their attention toward the closing remarks. My feet ached inside my sneakers, and my shoulders reminded me that I had been moving almost non-stop since before sunrise. Still, there was something satisfying about watching an evening survive its own chaos. I was collecting unused programs near the stage entrance when Melissa hurried toward me, looking unusually uncertain. "Claire, someone left this for you." She held out a simple cream-colored envelope with my name written neatly across the front. No company logo. No return address. Just Claire. I frowned. Nobody sent me notes at work. Curious, I opened it carefully. Inside rested a single invitation printed on thick ivory paper. Mr. Adrian Moretti requests the pleasure of your company at a private dinner this Thursday evening to discuss an opportunity that may interest you. Transportation will be provided if desired. I stared at the card, convinced it had been delivered to the wrong person. Melissa leaned closer. "Are you going?" I laughed softly. "There has to be some mistake." She looked at the elegant stationery again. People do not accidentally invite backstage coordinators to private dinners. I slipped the invitation back into its envelope, uncomfortable with the attention it immediately attracted. The event continued around us, but for the first time all evening I struggled to focus. Why would someone like Adrian Moretti want to have dinner with me? We had exchanged only a handful of conversations, none lasting more than a minute. The answer arrived sooner than I expected. As the final guests began making their way toward the exit, I crossed the now quiet lobby carrying a box of leftover event badges. Adrian stood near the grand staircase speaking with several foundation directors. The crowd around him gradually dispersed until only the two of us remained within earshot. I approached with the envelope still in my hand. "Excuse me," I said. "I think someone accidentally delivered this to me." His eyes dropped briefly to the invitation before returning to my face. "No accident." I held the envelope out toward him. "I appreciate the thought, but I think you are looking for someone else." A small smile appeared, patient rather than amused. "I rarely confuse names." I took a slow breath. "With respect, Mr. Moretti, I organize equipment schedules. I repair dresses. I tape cables to the floor. I do not attend private dinners with people who appear on national television." He folded his hands calmly in front of him. "I know exactly what you do. That is why I invited you." I shook my head almost instinctively. "Thank you, but I cannot accept." His expression did not change. "May I ask why?" "Because I have learned that when people with extraordinary influence suddenly notice ordinary people, there is usually a reason neither of them fully understands yet. I prefer ordinary. It is honest." For the first time since we met, Adrian remained completely silent for several seconds. There was no disappointment in his face. No irritation. Only thoughtful consideration, as though my answer interested him more than my acceptance ever could have. Finally he nodded once. "That is a fair answer." I relaxed, believing the conversation had ended. Instead he reached into his jacket pocket and removed a business card, placing it gently on the nearby reception table rather than handing it directly to me. "Then allow me to make a different offer. No obligation. No expectations. If you ever decide you would like to talk about creating more opportunities for people who never receive recognition, call me. If you never call, I will respect that decision." He turned toward the theater entrance before adding one final sentence without looking back. "The brightest people I have ever met were almost never the loudest." Then he walked into the cool Manhattan night surrounded by nothing more dramatic than quiet footsteps and city lights. I stood alone in the nearly empty lobby staring at the business card resting on polished marble, wondering why saying no somehow felt like the beginning of something instead of the end. 3 days passed before I looked at Adrian Moretti's business card again. I had slipped it inside the front pocket of my planner, telling myself I was saving it only because expensive cardstock felt wasteful to throw away. The truth was less convincing. Every morning I found myself checking that it was still there before heading to work. Every evening I reminded myself that I had no intention of calling. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Theater schedules, freelance production jobs, and weekend community events filled every hour I could sell. Invisible people did not have the luxury of overthinking unusual encounters. Rent still arrived on the first of every month whether a powerful businessman remembered your name or not. Tuesday afternoon found me volunteering at the neighborhood youth arts center, helping teenagers prepare displays for a local exhibition. It was unpaid work, but watching nervous young artists hang their first paintings on real gallery walls always felt worth more than another paycheck. 15-year-old Maya stood beside one of her watercolor landscapes twisting the sleeve of her sweater. "Nobody is going to stop and look at mine," she whispered. I adjusted the frame until it hung perfectly straight before smiling at her. "You do not get to decide whose heart your work reaches. Your job is simply to let people see it." She nodded slowly, though uncertainty still lingered in her eyes. My phone vibrated just as I stepped down from the ladder. An unfamiliar number appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it before answering. "Hello? Miss Bennett?" A calm female voice responded. "My name is Evelyn. I work with the Moretti Foundation. Mr. Moretti asked me to respect your decision, so I am not calling about dinner." I relaxed slightly. "Then why are you calling?" "We recently learned that the Youth Arts Center where you volunteer is about to lose its building lease." I looked around the room instinctively. Children laughed nearby while parents arranged folding chairs for the evening showcase. Only a handful of volunteers even knew about the financial difficulties. how did you hear that? Community organizations speak with one another more often than people realize, Evelyn answered politely. Mr. Moretti wondered whether you might be willing to meet for 15 minutes. Not to discuss you. To discuss them. I remained silent. She continued before I could refuse. If your answer is still no, nothing changes. The foundation will continue supporting other programs. We simply thought you would know what this community truly needs. That sentence followed me long after the call ended. Not what Adrian wanted. What the community needed. I spent the rest of the afternoon helping children arrange paintings while quietly arguing with myself. Accepting the meeting did not mean accepting favors. It did not mean changing my life. It meant speaking for people whose voices rarely reached donors with the ability to help. As the exhibition opened that evening, Maya tugged gently on my sleeve. Miss Claire, someone bought my painting. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. Really? She nodded so hard that her ponytail bounced. A man came before everyone else arrived. He said he liked supporting First Beginnings. He did not even ask for a discount. She held up the receipt. The buyer's name had been left blank, replaced by only one sentence typed beneath the transaction. Every artist deserves someone who believes before the applause begins. I stared at the paper longer than necessary. There was no signature. None was needed. I reached into my planner after the last family left and slowly removed the business card I had promised myself I would never use. The city lights outside the community center shimmered across the windshield of my aging sedan as I sat behind the steering wheel. My thumb hovered over the phone for nearly a full minute before I finally dialed the number printed beneath Adrian Moretti's name, still believing I was calling for everyone except myself. I expected a receptionist, maybe an assistant who would schedule a meeting weeks away after several polite emails. Instead, the phone rang only once. Adrian Moretti speaking. His voice carried the same calm confidence I remembered from the theater, steady enough that for a second I wondered if he had somehow known I would eventually call. I hesitated just long enough to feel embarrassed by the silence. This is Claire Bennett. I know. The simple answer caught me off guard. I almost laughed. Of course he knew. You said there would be no pressure, I replied. I hope this call does not change that. It will not, he answered immediately. Are you calling for yourself or for someone else? I looked through the windshield toward the small brick building where volunteers were folding chairs and switching off lights one room at a time. For the Arts Center. They are running out of time. There was a brief pause. Then tell me when you are free tomorrow. The meeting took place the following afternoon, not in a towering corporate office or an exclusive private club as I had imagined, but inside the foundation headquarters occupying the renovated top floors of an old warehouse overlooking the Hudson River. Sunlight poured through enormous industrial windows onto polished wood floors lined with photographs instead of expensive artwork. The walls displayed children painting murals, veterans rebuilding homes, teachers standing beside crowded classrooms, and community gardens blooming between apartment buildings. There were no oversized portraits of Adrian. No trophies. No reminders of personal success. The receptionist welcomed me by name and offered coffee before leading me toward a conference room with glass walls that overlooked the river. My heartbeat quickened anyway. Adrian stood when I entered. No security surrounded him. No photographers waited nearby. He wore a navy suit without a tie, his sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms as if he had been reviewing paperwork rather than preparing for an important meeting. Thank you for coming, he said. Thank you for giving me a reason to. I sat across from him, placing a folder filled with photographs, budgets, and handwritten notes onto the table. He did not touch it immediately. Instead he asked, "How is the young artist whose painting sold?" I blinked in surprise. Maya? She is smiling more than she did last week. Good, he said quietly. Confidence is often built one small victory at a time. Only then did he open the folder. For nearly an hour I explained everything I knew about the Youth Arts Center. The leaking roof. the outdated equipment. The families who could not afford private lessons. The volunteers working second jobs just to keep the doors open. Adrian listened without interrupting, occasionally asking questions so thoughtful they revealed he cared less about numbers than people. Which program changes the most lives? Which expense creates the biggest difference? If funding lasted only 1 year, what would matter most? Nobody had ever asked me those questions before. Most donors wanted recognition. He wanted understanding. When I finished speaking, he closed the folder carefully. I expected promises or polite excuses. Instead, he looked toward the photographs covering the hallway outside the conference room. Every picture out there began with someone who believed they were too ordinary to make a difference, he said. I simply gave them enough room to prove themselves wrong. Before I could answer, the conference room door opened gently. An older woman carrying accounting files smiled warmly at Adrian. Excuse me for interrupting. The scholarship committee approved all 12 applications. Wonderful, Adrian replied. Make sure every family hears the news before the letters become public. They deserve to celebrate first. She smiled before leaving. I watched the door close behind her, realizing every employee I had passed in the building greeted him without fear or forced enthusiasm. They respected him because he respected them. That quiet discovery unsettled me more than anything else had. The stories people whispered about powerful men rarely matched what I had seen with my own eyes. As I gathered my folder, Adrian walked me toward the elevator. Just before the doors opened, he said something that stayed with me long after I returned to the street. Claire, you keep believing I invited the wrong person into this building. I think you are finally beginning to understand that I have been waiting for the right one all along. The elevator doors closed behind me with a soft chime, but Adrian's final words refused to stay inside the building. I think you are finally beginning to understand that I have been waiting for the right one all along. During the drive home across the West Side Highway, I replayed the conversation over and over, searching for hidden meanings that probably were not there. He had never spoken down to me. Never tried to impress me. Never made me feel small because our lives existed in completely different worlds. Instead, he listened with a level of attention that felt almost unfamiliar. The following week passed faster than I expected. The Youth Arts Center continued preparing for its annual neighborhood showcase while everyone quietly worried about whether it might be their last. Nobody mentioned the meeting with the foundation because I had not promised them anything. Hope deserved honesty more than optimism. Thursday afternoon arrived wrapped in gray clouds and steady rain. I was arranging folding easels inside the center when my phone buzzed. It was Evelyn. Miss Bennett, the foundation board would like to visit the Arts Center tomorrow morning before making its final decision. Would you be willing to show everyone around? My first instinct was to say yes. My second was to ask the question that mattered. Will Mr. Moretti be there? There was the faint sound of papers turning before Evelyn answered. Yes. Along with several trustees. The visit lasted less than an hour, but it felt important from the moment the black SUV stopped outside the old brick building. Parents straightened bulletin boards. Children nervously adjusted paintings hanging slightly crooked on worn walls. Volunteers swept floors that had already been cleaned twice that morning. Nobody wanted sympathy. They wanted the chance to be seen fairly. Adrian arrived without ceremony, holding an umbrella for one of the older trustees instead of allowing someone else to do it. That single gesture relaxed the room more than any speech could have. I guided the group through classrooms where children practiced music, painted murals, and rehearsed short plays. Every room told the same story. Limited resources. Unlimited effort. One trustee paused beside a cracked piano. Replacing this alone would cost thousands of dollars. Another quietly noted the damaged ceiling tiles. Their questions became increasingly practical. Budgets. Insurance. Maintenance. I answered as honestly as I could, but halfway through the tour I realized something was changing. They were studying the building more than the people inside it. We reached the largest classroom where Maya stood beside several student paintings. One trustee smiled politely before whispering to another board member, perhaps the money would accomplish more at one of the larger institutions downtown. They already have stronger visibility. I looked around the room. The children heard those words even if the adults pretended otherwise. Maya lowered her eyes toward the floor. Several younger students stopped smiling altogether. Before anyone else could continue the discussion, I spoke without thinking. Visibility is exactly why those larger institutions will survive without this grant. This place exists for children who have nowhere else to discover they matter. The room became unexpectedly quiet. I worried for an instant that I had overstepped my role. One trustee folded his arms thoughtfully. And what if the investment reaches fewer students? I met his eyes. Then every one of those students will still know someone believed they were worth investing in. Sometimes changing one life completely matters more than touching 100 lives briefly. Nobody answered immediately. The silence stretched across the classroom while rain tapped gently against the windows. Finally, Adrian looked toward the children instead of the board members. Miss Bennett is correct. Numbers measure attendance. They do not measure possibility. He walked over to Maya's painting, studying it for several quiet seconds before turning back toward the trustees. Tell me honestly, he asked, if nobody had believed in this young artist before today, how would any spreadsheet ever calculate the masterpiece she might create 10 years from now? I watched the expressions around the room soften one by one. For the first time since entering the building, they had stopped evaluating costs and started seeing people. Standing quietly beside the doorway, I realized that I had not changed Adrian's opinion that morning. Together, we had changed everyone else's. The board members left the Arts Center carrying more than reports and budget estimates. They left carrying conversations that continued long after the doors closed behind them. The children returned to their projects, laughter gradually replacing the nervous silence that had filled the building only minutes earlier. I stayed behind to help stack paint supplies and fold display tables, convincing myself the day had ended. It had not. As I carried a box of brushes toward the storage room, my phone buzzed with a news alert. Community Foundation Chairman Adrian Moretti announces major expansion vote scheduled next week. Curious, I opened the article. The first photograph showed Adrian speaking with trustees outside the Arts Center. The second showed several students waving from the entrance. Then I noticed the comments beneath the story. Most were supportive. A few questioned why such a small neighborhood program deserved attention. One comment stopped me cold. She only got his attention because she knows the right people. Another followed. Funny how unknown volunteers suddenly appear beside wealthy donors. I closed the article almost immediately. I had spent years working comfortably in the background. Being misunderstood by strangers should not have mattered. Yet somehow it did. By early evening I was still thinking about those comments while locking the center's front door. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the sidewalks shining beneath rows of streetlights. My phone rang again. Adrian. I answered after the second ring. Congratulations, I said before he could speak. I think today went well. It did, he replied, though his tone carried less satisfaction than I expected. Have you seen the news? I looked toward the quiet street. I have. He sighed softly. I was hoping you had not. They are just comments from people who do not know us. That does not make them harmless, he answered. I remained silent. After a moment he continued. Claire, I owe you an apology. You stepped forward to help your community. Instead, your name has become part of conversations you never asked to join. I leaned against the brick wall outside the building. Adrian, people have opinions. Tomorrow they will find someone else to write about. Perhaps. But I should have considered the attention my involvement would bring to your life. I smiled to myself. That sounded exactly like him. Worrying about consequences no one else had noticed. You once told me that kindness does not need an audience, I reminded him. I still believe that. So do I. Then let people misunderstand for a while. They usually get tired before the truth does. He laughed quietly, the first completely unguarded laugh I had heard from him. I suspect you have handled difficult situations before. More than I like to admit. The conversation drifted into comfortable silence again before Adrian spoke with unusual sincerity. Tomorrow morning several reporters will ask questions about today's visit. They will almost certainly ask about you. I can refuse to answer if you prefer. I thought about Maya, the other students, and the volunteers who had spent years hoping someone would notice their work. If my disappearing from the story meant the center might disappear with me, then staying invisible was no longer helping anyone. No, I answered carefully. Talk about the center. Talk about the children. Just leave me out of it if you can. He paused. I will honor that. The call ended, but sleep refused to come easily that night. The next morning I stopped for coffee before work, and the cashier recognized me from the online article. You are the lady from the arts center, right? I nodded awkwardly. She smiled warmly and placed an extra muffin inside my bag. My daughter learned to paint there when we could not afford lessons anywhere else. Thank you for fighting to keep it open. I walked back onto the sidewalk holding a paper cup in one hand and the unexpected kindness of a stranger in the other. At that moment I realized something important. Recognition could be noisy, unfair, and uncomfortable. But sometimes it also allowed gratitude to find the people who had quietly earned it all along. I learned the Foundation's decision on a quiet Monday morning without a dramatic announcement or flashing headlines. Evelyn called just after 8 while I was unlocking the front door of the Arts Center. Good morning, Claire. I wanted you to hear it from us before the press release goes out. The board voted unanimously. The building lease has been secured for the next 10 years, renovation funding has been approved, and a permanent scholarship program will begin this fall. For a moment I could not answer. I simply looked around the old lobby with its worn wooden floors, faded bulletin boards, and walls covered with children's paintings. Nothing had changed yet. And somehow everything had. Thank you, I finally whispered. Evelyn smiled through the phone. You should thank the children who reminded everyone why this place exists. After the call ended, I stood alone until the first students arrived. They noticed the tears before I managed to hide them. Did something happen? Maya asked carefully. I nodded. Yes. Something wonderful. Within minutes the building filled with cheers that echoed through every hallway. Parents hugged volunteers. Teachers laughed with the kind of relief that only follows months of uncertainty. I slipped quietly into the background, helping tape fresh drawings onto the walls while everyone else celebrated. That afternoon, another invitation arrived from the Moretti Foundation. This one was different. It was not private. The foundation planned to host a citywide celebration recognizing organizations and volunteers whose work had transformed local communities. My name appeared on the guest list. I called Adrian before I could overthink it. I thought we agreed to keep me out of the spotlight, I said. We did, he replied gently. This event is not about putting you in a spotlight. It is about thanking people who spent years standing outside of one. I leaned against the window of my apartment, watching late afternoon sunlight settle across neighboring rooftops. There are hundreds of volunteers who deserve recognition. Then let them receive it, he answered. But do not refuse gratitude simply because it feels unfamiliar. Sometimes accepting appreciation gives others permission to value their own work as well. His words stayed with me long after the call ended. The evening of the celebration arrived beneath a clear autumn sky. Unlike the gala where we first met, this venue felt welcoming instead of intimidating. Community leaders, teachers, firefighters, nurses, artists, and volunteers filled the ballroom with conversations that sounded genuine rather than rehearsed. Name badges replaced celebrity introductions. Laughter replaced carefully practiced speeches. I spotted Adrian near the entrance speaking with several scholarship recipients instead of the city's most influential guests. When he noticed me, he walked over without hesitation. "You came," he said with a quiet smile. "I almost did not." "I know. What changed your mind?" I looked around the room. Everywhere I turned, ordinary people were celebrating one another instead of themselves. I realized this evening was never really about me. Adrian nodded. "That realization is exactly why you belong here." Before I could respond, one of the event organizers approached us carrying a printed program. "Adrian, we have one small change." The board added a special recognition at the end of the ceremony. "They would like your approval." He accepted the program, scanned the final page, then looked toward me with an expression I could not quite read. Surprise mixed with quiet satisfaction. He closed the booklet without showing me. "I think they made the right decision," he said. I frowned playfully. "You are not going to tell me what it says, are you?" He smiled just enough to reveal that rare warmth I had come to recognize. Some moments deserve to arrive exactly when they are meant to. Tonight is one of them. The ballroom lights slowly dimmed until every conversation softened into an expectant hush. A single spotlight illuminated the stage where the master of ceremonies welcomed hundreds of guests whose lives had been devoted to serving others without asking for recognition in return. One by one, teachers, first responders, neighborhood organizers, mentors, and volunteers walked across the stage to warm applause. Every story sounded extraordinary precisely because none of the people being honored believed they had done anything extraordinary. I sat near the back of the room exactly where I had requested, comfortable watching others receive the appreciation they had quietly earned. Adrian remained several tables away, speaking only occasionally while giving his full attention to each recipient instead of the cameras moving through the ballroom. It reminded me of the first night we met. He still seemed more interested in people than attention. As the ceremony approached its conclusion, the master of ceremonies smiled toward the audience. "Before we close this evening, the foundation board has approved one final recognition. It is not for the loudest voice, the largest donation, or the highest title. It is for someone who reminded us that communities are transformed by people who choose kindness when they believe nobody is watching." My heart slowed for reasons I could not explain. A large screen behind the stage came alive with photographs from community events across the city. Children painting colorful murals. Volunteers stacking chairs after neighborhood dinners. Teachers unlocking classrooms before sunrise. Families planting flowers in empty lots. Then I recognized one photograph. It was the Youth Arts Center. Another appeared. The theater backstage during the awards gala. Then another. Maya smiling beside her first sold painting. I stared at the screen, completely still. The master of ceremonies continued. "This individual never asked to be recognized. In fact, she politely declined every opportunity we offered. She believed her work mattered more than her name. Tonight we respectfully disagree." My table grew unusually quiet. Someone gently touched my shoulder. "Claire, I think they mean you." Before I could respond, my name appeared across the enormous screen in bright white letters that reflected through the ballroom like morning sunlight. Claire Bennett. There were no flashing graphics. No dramatic music. Only steady applause that grew stronger with every passing second. I remained frozen in my chair until I noticed Adrian standing first. He did not gesture toward the stage. He did not encourage the applause. He simply stood with quiet respect, and one by one the entire ballroom rose beside him. I walked toward the stage almost in disbelief, every step feeling unreal. When I reached the podium, I looked across hundreds of familiar and unfamiliar faces waiting for a speech. Instead, I smiled nervously and said the only honest thing I could think of. I spent most of my life believing that the best work happened where nobody could see it. I still believe that. But if tonight teaches us anything, I hope it is this. Every child deserves someone who notices them before the rest of the world does. Every volunteer deserves to know their time mattered. Every quiet act of kindness changes more lives than we will probably ever measure. The applause returned, louder than before, but I found myself searching the room for only one face. Adrian remained exactly where he had been, standing near the back instead of beside the stage. When our eyes met, he gave the smallest nod, almost invisible beneath the lights. It was not the expression of a man celebrating his own success. It was the peaceful look of someone watching another person finally receive what had belonged to her all along. In that moment I understood why he had never tried to place me at the center of the story. He had simply refused to let the world overlook it any longer. When the applause finally faded, the room settled into a peaceful silence unlike anything I had experienced before. It was not the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence that follows when people realize they have witnessed something genuine. I stepped away from the podium carrying the crystal award with both hands, afraid less of dropping it than of believing I somehow deserved it alone. Along the edge of the ballroom, volunteers embraced one another. Teachers wiped away quiet tears. Parents smiled as their children pointed excitedly toward the stage, whispering that one day they wanted to help people too. If that happened, tonight had already accomplished more than any speech ever could. Adrian remained exactly where I had last seen him, speaking with one of the scholarship students who had attended the event. He listened to the young man with complete attention, as though there were nowhere else in the world he needed to be. When their conversation ended, he walked toward me carrying nothing except the same calm expression that had first caught my attention months earlier beneath the lights of the theater. "Congratulations," he said softly. I smiled and looked down at the award before answering. "It feels strange holding something that belongs to so many people." He nodded. "That is probably why they chose the right person." We slowly walked onto the terrace overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The cool evening air carried the distant sound of traffic below while thousands of city lights stretched toward the horizon. For a few moments neither of us spoke. We simply watched the skyline together. Finally I broke the silence. "You knew this was going to happen tonight, did not you?" Adrian smiled without denying it. "I knew the board wanted to recognize someone whose actions had reminded all of us what leadership actually looks like. I did not know whether you would forgive me for allowing it to happen." I laughed quietly. "I am still deciding." His eyes reflected the city lights as he leaned lightly against the terrace railing. "Then let me risk one more honest answer. You once believed I invited the wrong person into my world." "I did." "And now?" I looked back through the ballroom windows where volunteers continued celebrating with one another. "I think I finally understand that it was never your world. It was always theirs. You were simply protecting it until more people noticed." Adrian looked toward the ballroom before speaking with the same quiet certainty that had marked every meaningful conversation between us. "Power can open doors. It cannot teach people why those doors should remain open. You taught us that." I shook my head gently. "No. I only reminded everyone of something they already knew but had forgotten." He smiled, and for the first time I realized that the distance between us had never been measured by wealth, influence, or reputation. It had only been measured by perspective. Before we returned inside, Adrian said one final sentence that I knew I would remember for the rest of my life. "The lights were never mine to give you, Claire. They were simply waiting for the world to look in the right direction." Months later, the renovated arts center reopened with bright classrooms, new instruments, fresh paint, and walls covered by even more children's artwork than before. Maya's newest painting hung proudly near the entrance beside a small plaque celebrating young local artists. Families filled every room with laughter. Volunteers welcomed new students through doors that almost never closed. My own name appeared occasionally in newspapers and community newsletters after that, but those headlines always disappeared with time. The children did not. Their dreams did not. Their opportunities did not. Looking back now, I no longer remember the exact moment my life changed. It was not the applause, the award, or seeing my name illuminated for an evening. It was discovering that the brightest light any person can leave behind is not the one shining on them. It is the one they quietly leave burning for someone else.